Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 3GMY's Book Talk series with today's special guest, Dr. Bernice Lerner. For those of you who don't know, my name is Shannon Saks, and I'm a 3G board member, but I'm also the grandchild of two Holocaust survivors, Manya and Samuel Saks. My beloved paternal grandmother, Manya, was liberated from Bergen-Belsen, so today's talk is of special interest to me. For those of you who are new to our community, 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and our supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance. We've all seen the heartbreaking studies showing the lack of Holocaust knowledge among recent high school and college graduates. The good news is that students who do receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They're more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more likely to be upstanders. Needless to say, education is the answer. This is why our We Educate or We Do program through 3G is so critical today. We Do is our specialized training program, which teaches grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their family testimony in school classrooms. 3GNY has trained over 250 speakers in New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C., and we have reached over 25,000 young minds. But we need to do more. In light of the COVID pandemic, we have transitioned many of our events and school visits to a virtual setting, including today's book talk. We have also created new events, such as our popular We Do Wednesdays, in which 3G trainees share their family stories in a bi-weekly Zoom setting. Through our grandparents' testimony, we talk about the importance of stepping in early and often where small injustices are found. Hope is not lost. We need to keep doing this work, and we need to keep educating our youth. To that end, you can help us accomplish this through a financial gift of any amount. Your contributions will go directly towards training more speakers and thus reaching even more students. We don't solicit donations from schools, teachers, or students, but we provide education and programming to schools completely free, and we aim to keep the cost of training 3Gs as low as possible. There's a link in the chat, and it provides ways you can donate, and we hope that you consider making a gift. Thank you for helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never forget is more than just an empty phrase. So, as I mentioned earlier, today we have Dr. Bernice Lerner with us. She's a successful author, distinguished lecturer, astute dean and professor, beloved mother and grandmother, as well as a slew of other loving and admirable adjectives, attributes, and accomplishments. Additionally, Dr. Lerner earned her bachelor's degree from Stony Brook University, graduating summa cum laude. She obtained a master's degree from JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and a doctorate from Boston University. She's a senior scholar at Boston University's Center for Character and Social Responsibility and a former dean of adult learning at Hebrew College. Dr. Lerner recently published a book, All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen. 3 weeks before the end of World War II, the Germans, in an unprecedented move, handed the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp over to the British Second Army. Upon entering the camp, Brigadier Rachel Glyn Hughes found 10,000 unburied dead and nearly 60,000 war-ravaged inmates. Among those at death's door was 15-year-old Rachel Genuth. Hope I got that right. In her book and in today's book talk, Dr. Lerner will share how she unearthed Rachel's story and researched the life of Brigadier Glyn Hughes. She will discuss how the liberation was experienced by those two protagonists and why it was a watershed moment, not only for the survivors of Hitler's scourge, but also for those who struggle to control the raging epidemics and to save as many lives as possible. Now, before I introduce Dr. Lerner, it's with great honor that I introduce you all to one of the protagonists of the book, Ruth Mermelstein, nee Rachel Genuth, Bernice's mother. I think she wants to just wave and say hi if she can.
Yes, thank you very much. And you did a beautiful introduction. You are terrific. You're a very smart young lady.
Thank you. Ms. Mermelstein, along with her daughter, will answer questions for us after Dr. Lerner speaks. So now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Lerner. Take it away, Ms. Lerner.
Thank you so much, Shannon, and thank you so much to 3G New York. I am so impressed and comforted by the fact that you're here and you're doing all this amazing work. It's really nice as a 2G to know that there's an active 3G doing this really important work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a slide presentation. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll open the floor. We'll open the floor to questions from, you can ask me any questions. You can ask my mom any questions. How blessed and fortunate I am, and we all are, to have my mom still here. She's a prominent speaker. She speaks to high school kids and middle school kids really all over the country and all over the world. And we're lucky that we still have her with us. I was very lucky that I had her with me through all the years that I did the research on this book. It was for my whole life, but the book took about 16 years to research and write and get published. And she was with me every step of the way. I could always call her or email her with a question. And as you may know, some of you from interviewing or speaking with your parents or grandparents, it's not always easy to dive into a particular place and time and, you know, call up your mom and say, when you were on the death march, what were you wearing? So anyway, she was always very forthcoming, always willing to answer my questions honestly with really compelling anecdotes. And if not for her sharing with me in that way, I would not have been able to write this book. I was also I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to write the book, but I just want to briefly mention that this past week we commemorated Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, the first really big pogrom where if the Jews in Germany didn't see the writing on the wall beforehand from Hitler's coming to power and the Nuremberg laws, certainly on November 9th, 10th, 1938, they saw what was happening. 7,000 Jewish businesses were looted. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated. Brown shirts were breaking into people's homes, and 91 Jews were killed, and 30,000 Jewish men were taken to concentration camps. So that was portending what was to come, and that was the beginning. Fast forward 7 years, and you have the end. And the end, most of the images we have from the end of the war were from Bergen-Belsen. The British Second Army came in, and their film and photographic unit took so many reels of film and so many photographs, and it was probably the most documented liberation in the history of the world. And it was probably the largest and most extraordinary liberation in the history of the world. And we know what happened in those interim 7 years. We know about the horrors of Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor and Chelmno and Belzec and Majdanek, and about all the labor camps, the thousands of labor camps where Jews were tortured and other people and some other people. But Bergen-Belsen is not often understood, and its differences from a place like Auschwitz. So whereas Auschwitz people were killed upon arrival very quickly, they were chosen to be gassed. You didn't often see people who had deteriorated to the point of being skeletons because they were killed. So many were killed right away. In Bergen-Belsen, and I really tremble when I say this, you found the war ravaged, the people who had already been through so much, who had evaded the gas chamber, who had been through slave labor, who had been on death marches, and who were literally dumped in this place in Northwest Germany as the Allied forces were approaching. They were marched away from the Russians on the east, and really this was the place where they were deposited without any provisions. Severely overcrowded huts or barracks, no medical care, no lavatories, and finally, in the last week, there was no food and no water. There were three epidemics that were raging. There was probably every disease known to man in the camp, but three epidemics were raging. Lice-borne typhus that had been brought in with a transport from Hungary in late January. There was pulmonary tuberculosis with people who were having fever and hacking coughs, and gastroenteritis, diarrhea. The huts inside were one mass of human excreta. It was a scene that the liberators were so shocked at and they described it maybe as Dante's hell. Even the people who were taking the photographs, their head was splitting. They couldn't cope with it. It was really difficult. So the book was inspired for me by a question, which was, how actually did my mother survive? Because she had been dumped in Bergen-Belsen 1 month before it was liberated. And she had fallen unconscious at the very end and could not say how she was saved. So I was interested in the literal, because I had known so much about her story and where she was when, and about things that happened to her and things she was observing. I was curious about that piece, like what happened after she fell unconscious, and how did she get from this dung-infested hut to this makeshift hospital room? And that made me want to explore the mechanics of the rescue. And that led me to Brigadier Glyn Hughes. And when I discovered Glyn Hughes and I started to delve into this person, this man, he surfaced as a very compelling character. And there had been no book about him. He was kind of like an Oscar Schindler figure in that he maintained friendships with survivors for the rest of his life. He was deeply moved by his experience of meeting them and getting to know them and seeing them recover. And he became a great champion of the state of Israel and, by extension, the Jewish people. He really saw his role in their narrative history. So I was interested in who was he? What inspired his moral motivation in trying to save as many lives as possible? He had to make really hard decisions. He had to suppress some of his empathy because he had to arrive at a system of triage. What did he experience? What did he bring to this? What had he seen before this? What had he known of war? The title of the book comes from Glyn Hughes when he testified at the Belsen trial. He was the first witness at the first trial that invoked international law to prosecute Nazi war criminals. And he said, "I have seen all the horrors of war, but I have seen nothing to touch it," meaning what he saw in Bergen-Belsen. So I wanted to know what he brought to the experience, what kind of man he was, and then how did he emerge from it? What sort of things did he do after this experience with the rest of his life? So I was curious about him. I was curious about my mother and writing about her, this little girl. In order to write about her, it took me many years. At first, I wanted to write about Glyn Hughes. Only later did I decide to write a dual biography. I had to sort of separate myself and look at her as this little girl going through these experiences because she was so young at the time. And what was her character like? She's she's very compelling in her own right. She's a very different type of person than an Anne Frank, from a very different background. She had a hardscrabble childhood, and she was kind of interesting. So I wanted to write about these two different personalities. So I'm now going to share my screen and show you some slides. Okay. Okay, so here's my book on the left, All the Horrors of War, and it was simultaneously published in the UK. And you can see what the different publishers did. They had the same images, but they came up with completely different titles and designs for the cover. And you see on this, my mom, this is one of the early pictures of her. She's 16 years old in this picture, and she is at a tuberculosis sanatorium in snowy northwest Sweden called Arvika. And she is all alone in the world. Sometimes you see these pictures of these happy survivors. Some of them are in their 20s and 30s, and they're mourning, and they're also starting to rebuild. They're meeting their spouses, and they're having babies. There was a big baby boom in Bergen-Belsen in the DP camps after the war. But she was a kid, and she was without her parents, and she had it was only her and her older sister who survived, and she had 4 younger siblings who were murdered in Auschwitz along with her parents and her grandmother. And there's Glyn Hughes, and he has a startled look on his face. He's probably surprised by the photographer. He's in his caravan doing work in Bergen-Belsen. Who knows what he's working on? He could have been writing up the 5 diets that he was prescribing for the starved. And so what I did was I came up with this with my editor. We decided to tell the story of the two protagonists over 1 year's time, the last year of the war, 1944, spring 1944 to spring 1945. So you can see the journey of Glyn Hughes. He's preparing, he's pretty high level position. He's at this point in spring of 1944, he's Deputy Director of Medical Services for the British Second Army's 8th Corps, and he's preparing for the D-Day landing. He's having a lot of secret meetings, and then, going back, you see he's, as they cross the channel, what is his experience like in Normandy through the battles? What is he concerned with? What's occupying his mind? What is he involved with? Until the fortress of Germany is breached and they land in this shocking hell, and he suddenly finds himself responsible for 60,000 inmates, 25,000 of whom need immediate hospitalization. And one of them is my mother, who starts off in spring of 1944 in Siget, the same town Elie Wiesel is from. And this was the train route, which was tracked pretty accurately. This train route no longer exists, but it was at the time how they took people to Auschwitz. And then from Auschwitz, she was taken to a labor camp called Christianstadt, and then on a death march, and then on another train to open cattle car to Bergen-Belsen, where she landed after already a very, very deadly journey. So April 15th, 1945, the British, through a very unusual turn of events, very unprecedented in the history of the war. If you think about it, on April 4th, Himmler gave the order that to the head of Flossenburg and Dachau that no inmate was going to be handed over alive to the Allies. And here on April 12th, he reached a different agreement. And I write about that in the book, why? This is like a stranger than truth story. Why did Himmler decide to hand over Bergen-Belsen with the largest number of inmates to the British Army 3 weeks before the war is over? And one of the parts of the truce is they had to erect danger typhus signs everywhere. And the bottom right slide is of the camp at the time of the liberation, and there is a road bisecting the camp. There's I don't remember if it's on the right or the left, but there's 3 huge camps on the right, 2 on the left, and this is only Camp 1. There's a separate camp, Camp 2. Camp 1 contained about 41,000 very, very sick and dying, and mountains of corpses, and Camp 2 contained about 20,000 more recent arrivals who were emaciated, but typhus hadn't reached that camp. So I tried not to, it's very hard. I don't want to further dehumanize the victims. I really tremble showing you these slides, and you can probably see even more graphic ones on Google Images, but I'll just show you that they pressed one of the first things they did was they pressed the SS. There were about 80 or something SS remaining in the camp, and they pressed them into service to help bury the backload of dead. It took about 2 weeks to bury all the people, and they had no choice. Glyn Hughes had no choice but to have mass graves. And here's Leslie Hardman on the bottom picture, and he is the British Second Army chaplain who is really, really disturbed by how people are being buried and really forlorn. And he practically suffered a nervous breakdown. He was trying to minister to the survivors day and night. And the picture on the upper right, there's a picture of a girl with a square cut out of the back of her coat. And I show that just as an illustration of story, you know, what my mother told me, which you can read about elsewhere, is that so people should not be so they should be easily identifiable as prisoners. If they try to escape, they had squares cut out of the backs of their coats. And here you see on the bottom right a tent city. On April 18th, 3 days after the British came in, they came and they pitched a dump of tentage, and they tried to remove from the huts those prisoners who could still walk, to try to get food and water into those who could not leave the huts, who were just too sick. So they tried to relieve the overcrowding. And if you see the distance between the huts and the tents, this is significant in my mother's story because she had to crawl back and forth between them. And then came the rescue effort. You'll see, you know, how now we have PPE equipment, you know, everyone's, those on the front lines of COVID have to protect themselves. And the same was true here of the men of the British 11th Light Field Ambulance, who had clean ambulances and contaminated ambulances. They would evacuate the inmates from the huts, strip them, wrap them in blankets, and take them to a place called the human laundry. After they were washed, they were then rinsed, and they were really cleaned by German nurses who had to be pressed into service because there was such a dearth of personnel. There was nobody to do this work. So, and that freaked some of the inmates out, that they were being cared for German nurses who were, and I described the attitude of the German nurses in my book and some of the reactions to them, but they had to be washed and sprayed with DDT and then taken in clean ambulances to a makeshift hospital area. So some approximate numbers: there were 2 million British and other Allied soldiers concentrated in southern England in May 1944. And to personalize this, I thought of, this is what it took to save my mother. Like, why am I here? Why is she here? Why did she survive? And this may be true of survivors, you know, too. Like, what did it take from the Allied point of view? Like, what did it, so many soldiers lost their lives this way and became maimed for the rest of their lives. And just another statistic, 14,000 Jews were deported in 7 or 8 trains daily from Hungary to Auschwitz from May 15th to July 9th, 1944. And my mother was in the earlier transport. I think she arrived in Auschwitz on May 17th or 18th. 440,000 Jews, even more, were taken from Hungary to Auschwitz that spring. 90% were murdered right away. And if you've read the history, you know about the rapid fire killing of the Jews from Hungary when the war was clearly being lost by the Germans. And some other, it was like a city in Auschwitz-Birkenau. There were over 31,000 female prisoners that month and 19,000 in July, and over 19,000 male prisoners. And you see there, I have skipped down to 25,000 fit, able to walk Belsen survivors who suffered from various stages of emaciation were transferred to the formerly Wehrmacht Transit and Rehabilitation Barracks, a separate area at Bergen-Belsen. And they went actually back and forth from there to the hospital area because some of the fit weren't really fit and were really very sick. But 750 to 1,000 prisoners were processed each day for over 3 weeks after the liberation at the human laundry. And because of some stories my mother told me, just anecdotes that she remembered, I was able to figure out that she was one of the first, and probably the second day, she was one of the people taken to the human laundry and then to a makeshift hospital barracks. And it was so hard getting personnel. There were only 361 British Army soldiers and medical personnel working in the relief of Bergen-Belsen on April 17th, 2 days after the liberation, because there were battles raging throughout Northwest Germany. It was very hard for Glyn Hughes to get help. And eventually he brought in help from different places, which is all in the book. And Many of you know that 500 former inmates died each day after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And there were 14,000 patients ultimately in the Glyn Hughes Hospital, the largest such facility in Europe, on May 19th, 1 month after the liberation. And it was named the Glyn Hughes Hospital because of survivors named it that because they noted the man's compassion. At this point, Glyn Hughes was Deputy Director of Medical Services for the entire British Second Army, and he gave the order for the last hut to be burned down in a ceremony on May 21st. And they didn't celebrate Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, on May 8th. They waited until the last person was evacuated from the last hut. And this is Glyn Hughes here. That's a picture of the hospital, which was really part of a larger complex. And this little island near Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean, Maldives, issued these stamps commemorating the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And it was interesting that one of the events that they had on a stamp they depicted is the burning of the barracks at Bergen-Belsen. And here's the actual picture of the fires and there was an effigy of Hitler on this last barrack standing. They had to burn down all the barracks because of the typhus everywhere. So, and this was a sign that they had erected at the infamous Belsen concentration camp, and sort of sarcastic, an example of Nazi culture. And here's my website where I have a lot more information. And I will show you now, just fast forward. There is an epilogue in my book where I detail more about what happened, but I'll just show you some photos here. Here's my mom. This is the first picture we have of her. We don't have a single picture of her from Siget, nothing. I don't know. I don't have a picture of my grandparents. I sometimes wish I could plumb my mom's brain and find out just what exactly they look like. And it's so sad for our family. We don't have that, but we have her. She survived, and she had been very severely beaten up at the end of the war. And you can see this is a few months later, the first picture of her. She is taken to Sweden. And Sweden took in about 7,000 of the survivors of Bergen-Belsen, aiming to put them on their feet, and with the idea that they would rehabilitate them and they would be repatriated and go on their way in 6 months. And that didn't, of course, happen. My mom was really sick, and she was in Sweden for 10 years after the war, in and out of TB sanatoriums. But here's the first picture we have of her. She's 15 in this picture. And fast forward a number of years, and she's here, a young lady with her sister in Sweden, and they're sort of recovering, coming to their own. And she meets my father, and he's a picture of my father in a displaced persons camp. He's on the right, and he's also a survivor. And here's their wedding photo. And here's my mom now, and she is a wonderful, positive person and source of all information in the book and inspiration for me in my life. And you'll hear from her soon. And here is Glyn Hughes at the time of the liberation, and here he is post-war, and he did a lot. He was a sportsman. He was very famous in England. He was one of the father figures of rugby football, a great golfer, but there was a lot more to him, and he took his experience in Bergen-Belsen and did some remarkable things with his life after that. And that's it, Shannon.
Thank you, Dr. Lerner, for gifting us with your family story and this wonderful book. There are a lot of similarities between your mother and my grandmother. I feel like my dad now. Every time he speaks about the Holocaust and our family story, we break down in tears. But anyway, we're going to open it up for questions. For Dr. Lerner and your mom, Miss Mermelstein. If you have any questions, please type them in the question answer box or in the chat, but we prefer in the question answer box, and we'll do our best to get the questions answered. Due to the high volume of questions we get during our lectures, not all of them can always be answered in a single time, so we'll forward them on to our guest speaker, and hopefully we'll get them answered for you. You can email us at info@3gnewyork.org. That's the number 3G New-York.org, info at, and we'll relay it to Dr. Lerner and Ms. Mermelstein. Bernice, talk to me about how the first time you came up with the idea. I know you said initially that, it was separate ideas. When did you kind of think of the separate ideas, and when did it finally come together for you?
So that happened, well, honestly, it's counterintuitive, but I wasn't about to write a book about my mother. It was always like a little too close. In fact, I wrote a previous book about 7 other Holocaust survivors who weren't in my family at all. They all different stories. They became academics in their post-war lives, not at all like my family. And then what happened was I discovered Glyn Hughes, and I started to write his biography. And people in my writing groups and friends kept saying, well, what about your mother's story? Your mother's story is so interesting. And then I thought, I didn't want to write 2 separate books. Is there a way I could combine them? And I started to write her story and his story. And I finally landed on this idea of telling both of their stories over 1 year's time. And so the book is structured like that. It's by season. Where is she, and where is the rescuer, and where is the victim, and what forces of war are blowing them toward this place in Northwest Germany. So maybe 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I started to incorporate my mother's story.
And as you briefly mentioned, there's so many unsung heroes of World War II. We all obviously know Oskar Schindler because, thanks Spielberg and all that. When did you first learn about Brigadier Hughes? And do you know, has he been recognized as one of the righteous among nations?
So I first learned about him when I had the question, how did my mother survive? He's very prominently associated with the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. If you Google liberation of Bergen-Belsen, he'll come up really quickly. And then I did like crazy things that sometimes biographers do. I went to London, I tracked down his daughter, I went into his school archives, I went to his medical school archives, I went into every place that he had files and records. I just really wanted to uncover more and more about him. So I read everything he wrote. I tried to read everything he wrote and everything written about him. So I'm sorry. So the question was,
is he righteous among the nations?
He's righteous among the Gentiles. So his people in England, people who really recognize his importance, tried very hard to get him. And he was not he was not elected by Yad Vashem to be righteous among the nations because he was not considered at risk of his own life at the time, and the war was nearly over. But he was honored by Yad Vashem UK at a huge ceremony about 7 years ago, and there were like 900 people there and dignitaries and everything, so he was recognized.
And have you gone back either with your mom or alone or with your family to Siget and seen where your family came from and, the progression through life?
Yeah, I went with my sister a year and a half ago. We went to Siget, and we went as part of a group of descendants of Siget survivors. And it was fascinating. It was just really, really important for me to see the streets she walked. And it was also so sad because you realize that the world she knew had disappeared. And I was comforted because Elie Wiesel's son, Elisha, was on our trip. And he said that when his father went back to Siget, he was seeing ghosts everywhere. And his father told him there were 2 Sigets. There's Siget as it is today in this world. It's in Romania. It's a poor town. It has a lot of culture there. It's beautiful surroundings. The mountains haven't moved. And then there's Siget Bashamayim, Siget in the heavens. And that was as he remembered it, as a very vibrant Jewish town where at least 40% of the population was Jewish. Shabbat was in the air, the holidays you just felt. And I tried to imagine that.
And so this next question is both for you and your mom. What's the message for third generation and the generations that follow? What's your guys' message for the future? Well, for the present and the future.
My message is to keep doing this important work, and it's just becoming ever more important. There are fewer and fewer survivors among us every day, and that 2Gs are getting old. So I really think I'm really so happy that 3G's picking up the ball. And Ma, do you have something you want to say?
Yes, I feel the same way. I feel very strongly that the 3Gs are picking up because so many people still don't know that there was a Holocaust, and the 3Gs are going to educate younger students, younger generations what really happened. And they are very important. The 3G is very important. They should speak up what they know, what they heard from their parents, and we should never forget what really happened to the Jewish people. And we should still be strong Jews and look out for others and make this a better world. We should try to do our best and always be optimistic and try to help those who are less fortunate.
Let's see. So scrolling through some of the questions and answers, there are a lot of, do you know this one? Are you related to this one? So a few people have asked for your email address or the best way to contact you. Do you want to give do you have an email you want to share, or can we just forward these questions to you, or how?
Yeah, the best way to contact me is just through the contact page on my website, which is bernicelerner.com. And if you have a question for my mom in there, you just contact me and you can say question for Ruth, and I'll send it to my mom and she'll respond. So it's just really simple, just through my website.
Okay, let's see. I'm just going to do a quick scroll here. Does anyone else have any other questions? There is a question whether or not you feel Holocaust education should be the obligation of our federal government or the states to ensure that it happens.
I think the federal government should introduce this as a law that Holocaust education should be in every school, especially for teenagers, for high schoolers, or even middle schoolers. I do a lot of speaking to middle schoolers. Here on Long Island, it's more almost obligatory to teach about the Holocaust in the schools. So, which is very good. Many states don't have this kind of law that they have to teach about the Holocaust, but here on Long Island they do. And I think it's good for the young people to know about it, to learn what really happened, and it shouldn't happen again.
Bernice, do you want to?
I agree. I think it's really important.
Let's see. We have a question. Was your family religious, secular, intellectual, or a combination? And how did they survive before the German occupation in late 1943?
My family, we were Orthodox. My father went to services every morning. Yeah, we were quite very, very observant in our home. And life went on, was quite normal till 1940, but by 1940 things changed because our area that I lived in Romania became Hungary. And of course, Hungary was allied with Nazi Germany, so they brought in all the anti-Semitic laws, and life started to be very hard for the Jewish people. And a lot of things went on. I lost my extended family, aunts and uncles and cousins, right in 1941. That was the first mass murder. They were taken away to the Ukraine with some kind of a made-up story that they were refugees and they were taken to the Ukraine and just marched into the woods and shot just because they were Jewish people. My mother's younger sister and her younger brother with their families, 5 little children. The parents were all in their 30s and the children were under 10 years old, and they were all taken and murdered right there. And our life was changed completely because my grandmother was crying day and night that those people were taken away. It's a long story. I usually tell the whole story about it, how it all happened. And also other bad things happened by 1942. Our life also changed very much because first the Hungarians called up all the young men to forced labor, and later they called up older men, and my father was 41 years old, and he was called up to forced labor, and my mother was pregnant with a sixth child, and life was very hard for us because he was taken away. And when they couldn't, they were worked practical to death, and their civilian clothes, summer and winter, with very poor nutrition. And when they couldn't work anymore, they were too weak to work, so they put them all in a big hall and locked the windows and the doors, and soldiers were standing around the building, and they put the building on fire. There were 600 or 700 young men just because they couldn't work anymore. But it so happened that some of the men still managed to break the windows or some planks in the barrack and crawl away from the burning building, while soldiers were standing around and shooting at them if they caught them. My father managed to escape, and he also helped two other men to escape. And they escaped, and they were in hiding in the barns, and then slowly crawling into the woods. In the woods, some partisans found them, and the partisans gave them a choice. This was in the beginning of 1943, and Russia was already liberated from the Germans, and the partisans gave them a choice. We can take you now to Russia, and you are going to be free. But if you want to go back to your own families, you have to know that all the Jewish families are going to be murdered in Europe. So my father and the two other men said, whatever is going to happen to our families is going to happen to us too. We want to rejoin our families. But they were still very weak, so the partisans took them to a hospital. And about 3 weeks later, when they were stronger, the government sends a telegram to us. My mother should come and pick him up. At this point, we have a 6-month-old baby in the house, and my grandmother came to stay with us, and my mother went to pick up my father from the Ukraine, from a hospital there. Ukraine was also part of Hungary at that time. She brought my father home, and we were so elated to have him home, even though he had two fingers frozen off because he had to wheel a bicycle for an officer in the middle of winter. But he was home, and our door was open continuously till we were taken away from there. People came from all over to ask, did you see my husband? Did you see my father? Did you see my relatives? And my father never wanted to give them bad news. So he always said, yes, the last time I saw them, they were in good shape, and you just have to hope that you're going to see them again. He just wanted to give everybody hope. That didn't happen earlier, when those people who were taken away in 1941, and how did we find out what happened to them? One man happened to come back and tell us what happened. There were about 22,000 people who were taken to the Ukraine, and they were lined up in front of ravines and shot them. But this man, he says he was shot in the leg, and he fell down in the mass grave, and the dead fell on top of him. And when the SS were walking away from there, drunk and laughing, he managed to crawl out from under the dead. And when he came back to tell us the story, nobody wanted to believe him. They called him a madman. This cannot happen in the 20th century. When he told it to my mother fainted. But when he told it to Elie Wiesel, he was a good friend of Elie Wiesel's, Elie Wiesel was a pupil of his. Elie Wiesel wrote in the book, life went on as normal after that, but not in our family, because we missed those relatives so very badly. My grandmother used to say they took away the stars from her eyes. She couldn't live without those children. She was crying every day for the rest of her life, every night. So one of our children had to stay with her.
So Ruth, what was it like for you to witness your daughter write this book and ask you lots of questions, and you helping her with the book, and how did you cope with the emotions that came up?
I think I'm very resilient, I'm strong, I'm always hopeful. And when she was asking me questions, she kept asking me questions from the time she was 7, 8 years old. She used to come down from her bed like, Mommy, I want a drink of water, just like Danny Kaye, I want a drink of water. So she used to come in just to ask me questions. Mommy, what did you do when you were 7 years old? And Mommy, what did you do when you were 8 years old and 10 years old? And finally, in the beginning, I didn't tell her about the sad stories. I was telling her about my adventures because I was a very adventurous kid from the time I was 2. anyway, she listened to all my stories. And finally, when she was around 14 years old, and we were down in the laundry room in the basement, and I was ironing, and then she asked, Mommy, what did you do when you were 14 years old? And then I started to tell her what I did. That was being in the concentration camp and being in Bergen-Belsen. I told her what I did. I was dragging dead bodies by the ankles to the mass graves through the dust and dirt. I put down the iron and put my hands in the back and told her how I was dragging dead bodies. That was very traumatic, but she wanted to know what I did. I told her what I did in the concentration camp. I sometimes had some nice things to tell her. Some people were nice to me and some people were not so nice. So I had some good things to tell her so she could go on listening to my stories.
So there's a question about being transported to Sweden. I know my grandma was transferred to a sanitarium in Sweden to recuperate. And I know my dad has always wondered if the transfer was in conjunction with the Count Bernadette White Bus operation, or if it was through the British Liberation. Do you know, tell us your story, how you got to Sweden versus what you know, how other people got to Sweden to recuperate.
As far as I remember, the Swedish Red Cross came in to try to take as many sick people as they could, even some who wasn't so sick, like a cousin or a sister who wasn't that sick. They brought them to Sweden, about 7,000. And of course, they didn't have enough hospitals yet ready. So the first transport, we were taken to a makeshift hospital, first a quarantine, like also in a university hall where we were sleeping on bunk beds, makeshift for a quarantine just for 4 weeks, and later on to a makeshift hospital that was usually a school that they turned into a hospital that was Katrineholm. And well, in Katrineholm, I got very sick. Maybe my daughter could show a picture that I was very sick in this place because I had very high temperature. I got pneumonia on top of having tuberculosis. So I had a very nice doctor there, a woman doctor. She was sitting with me a whole night and a whole day till my temperature broke because she felt sorry for me. There I was. I celebrated my 16th birthday in Sweden, and I was practically all alone. When we left Sweden, my sister and I, we were so naive and we couldn't advocate for ourselves. And we came on 2 different ships from Germany to Sweden. She wound up in a different hospital and I wound up in a different hospital. And yeah, it was very rough because we started to write to each other. We knew where we found out about each other. So we were writing and calling on the telephone. It was a rough time. It was very rough to be sick and young and not being able to do anything, not being missing out of school. As a matter of fact, I had to stop going to schools from the time I was 12 years old because my mother needed me home and my father was taken away to forced labor. Yeah, there's a lot to it. I think there's much more in the book, but if anybody has some specific questions about coming from Bergen-Belsen to Sweden, they treated us very nice in Sweden. I only have nice memories. I lived there almost 10 years. Whenever I could, they supported me to go to school. Whenever I was very sick, they took very good care of me, and I worked different kind of places. Sometimes the work was stressful and I got sick, but anyway, they put me on my feet, and I'm very grateful to the Swedish people.
The Swedish buses, the Swedish White Buses was a different operation. It wasn't from Bergen-Belsen. I'm not sure if it was from Ravensbrück or someplace else, and I think it was also before the war was over.
Thank you. So I know you're never supposed to ask a woman her age, but someone asked how old are you now? But let's just do, how old were you at the time of liberation?
I was 15, and I'm proud to say that I'm past 91.
Mazel tov.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that I could still see and hear and walk and take care of myself. I live alone in my home, and I enjoy every minute of it. And I am very proud of my daughters. I I have one daughter close by. She takes very good care of me because now I have to give up my car. I cannot drive any place. She takes me to the doctor or wherever I have to go, and she brings me everything that I need. She brings me more food than I could use of every kind. She's very good. I still cook for myself, and I take care of everything else.
So we have a question here from T. Golden. I was born in Bergen-Belsen. My mom told me how people tried to set up some normalcy to start living. Did you experience that?
Not me, but I know what happened, and Bernice knows more about it. She wrote about it because what happened was young people, we were supposed to go back to our own hometowns and whatever, but nobody really wanted to go back to without knowing that there is no family or no home anymore. So most of them stayed on in Bergen-Belsen in a DP camp, and most of the young people, 17 years and up, they got hooked up, got married, and had children there, and they lived there for quite a while. For I think they closed Bergen-Belsen by 1948 or even later, but I left Bergen-Belsen right in 1945.
Yeah, there's a big part of my book is about the post-war, the DPs setting up the DP camp in Bergen-Belsen, and that was a watershed for Glyn Hughes.
So I know this question's asked a lot from lots of survivors, lots of 3Gs. How do survivors deal with the nightmares that occur if you experience them, or how do you move on and recover from something, such a horrific thing that you went through? Or can you ever, actually?
It's true, we all have nightmares. We cannot shake it because we went through all those things, and it comes back. And lots of times before I have to do a testimony, speak to a group of people, I always go through my mind what I went through because I have to talk about it. So it never leaves us. All those horrible things never leaves us, really. But I think people tell me that I'm strong, I'm resilient, I'm positive, and I'm hopeful. So it helps me in some way. I'm not very needy, so I take care of myself.
We have a question, Bernice, about your research. How did you research this all? It's a very well researched book, a lot of detailed information. And in particular, someone wants to know good resources for Siget jewelry. So can you share with us how you've researched? Was it just a quick Google search, or did you, how exhaustive of your search?
No, so you when you're a biographer, you really try to uncover everything. You try to uncover things that aren't normally seen, way beyond Google. You go deep into the archives, which is the most exciting place for researchers to be. But you have to make sense of these mounds of materials, and I wrote probably several chapters that had to be completely cut from the book. I just tried to follow whatever line of inquiry I could. I was researching different things because I was trying to figure out where my mother was. I didn't find, the resources about Siget are Elie Wiesel's book. There's, you would see in my book, I used whoever wrote anything about Siget. I tried to read about it. I had a barrier. I had a handicap in that I didn't understand Hungarian. But my mom actually translated for me one Hungarian article. It was quite an academic article about the fire that she described her father had escaped from. And when I wrote about the chapter about her in Sweden, at one point she was in this school for children who were survivors, this small little international school. And the headmaster of the school wrote his PhD thesis about the girls and the school, and he wrote it in Swedish, and she translated that entire 100-page document for me. So I did what I could. I had that handicap of languages, but again, she was great at being able to help me with some of that. And I spent a lot of time, I would say, in the archives in England, in different libraries there.
see. Someone wants to know, I don't know if this is too personal, what fields are your degrees from? History, sociology, other? What was the topic of your MA thesis and PhD dissertation research? Feel free to say.
So I graduated, so I have I have an undergraduate degree in community and school health education, and I have a master's in Jewish education from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I think I did my Holocaust on some, my master's thesis on some kind of Holocaust education, but it was I was very discouraged when I was at the seminary. The Holocaust wasn't a field, and they were not interested in that. They were interested in how Jewish life is lived and not talking about the Holocaust very much. That was my feeling when I went to the seminary. So, and then when I did my doctorate at BU, it was the opposite, because I had these professors who weren't Jewish, who were totally like, you have to write about the Holocaust. They were just, so my dissertation was about these, I wrote about 8 Holocaust survivors who became professors in their post-war lives, who earned terminal degrees. And they were the intellectuals. My family wasn't. And I was interested in how they made sense of their experiences. And it wound up as a book of 7 Holocaust survivors called The Triumph of Wounded Souls. So that was my academic work. And then I did a lot of work in character and ethics education when I directed this center at BU.
I think we're going to have to close it up. But last question, what's your advice to those of us who continue to educate, especially in light of the times we're living in and the rise in anti-Semitism all over the world?
My advice is use testimony, use Holocaust survivor testimony. I think that there's a real failure. I mean, I hear a lot of things that are just so upsetting, like even in trying to get my book published, like from publishers, like the Holocaust isn't trending, or like, oh, you know, you hear like, oh, they're always talking about the Holocaust. And I feel like there's a real lack of really empathizing and really trying to get into the head of people who went through these experiences. Whether, you know, whatever it is that you're suffering in this world, there's real human beings that have these experiences. Try to be in another person's shoes. And testimony is really a way to do that. I think that I could be riveted just listening to the testimonies from the Eyewitness Project that Steven Spielberg founded, the Testimony Project out of the University of Southern California. What a treasure that we have these 52,000 testimonies. And so I would say, use the personal, connect to people on a personal level. That's what I would say. And that's what happens when my mom speaks to kids. I mean, they see a real survivor.
Yeah, obviously that's what we do here at 3G. You know, we have survivors come to Shabbos dinners, and we have survivors speak. And also with our We Do program, you know, we take our grandparents' stories and we bring it out to the public, because soon, you know, let's say in 120 years, we won't have any more survivors left. You know, we have, you know, our grandparents' stories to tell others about, to educate. And I think it's really important. So thank you so much for speaking today, for sharing your book, your family story. Thank you, Ruth, for coming, for joining us on our Zoom. We really, really appreciate you to stop by, listen to your daughter speak, and to answer questions for us. And thank you to all our viewers out there, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining us. We're so glad that you took the time to come and hear Dr. Lerner's family story and Ruth's story, and Glyn Hughes' story, Brigadier Glyn Hughes' story. If you're interested in purchasing Dr. Lerner's book, here it is again. Call your local bookstore. Keep local businesses in business, or get it on Amazon. And remember, if you haven't made a gift to support our educational programs here at 3GMY, we hope you'll consider making a donation today, now, tomorrow, by the end of the year, soon. In the chat should be all the links. I know you go to our website, and we appreciate all the support you guys have given us throughout all this. Again, Bernice, thank you. Ruth, thank you so much. Everyone have a great rest of your day. If you have any questions, info@3gnewyork.org. See you soon. Stay safe, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm very hopeful that the third 3G is involved with this. And I hope the generation after will also be involved, so it shouldn't be forgotten. And we have to spread things about it. We have to tell everybody, because there are so many people who still don't know about the Holocaust. Education is very important. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for being there. All special the 3G. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.